The Edison bulbs suspended throughout the Artemis Gallery cast amber light across white marble floors like captured fireflies, each filament glowing with calculated warmth. The exposed brick walls held canvases worth more than most Manhattan apartments, their gilt frames catching light in ways that made the art itself seem almost secondary to the wealth they represented. New York's elite circulated through the exhibition space with choreographed casualness, their champagne glasses held at precisely the correct angle, their laughter modulated to signal sophistication without enthusiasm. The opening night of the Pollock retrospective was less about appreciating abstract expressionism and more about being photographed appreciating it, about consolidating social capital and demonstrating cultural fluency in the most exclusive of arenas. Kathleen Gilpin stood before a particularly violent canvas, all controlled chaos and deliberate splatter, her champagne untouched, watching the performance unfold with the analytical detachment of someone who had learned to curate not just art, but her own survival. She wore a burgundy gown that fell off her shoulders with deliberate elegance, the wine-dark fabric catching light as she shifted her weight, revealing and concealing the graceful lines of her collarbones in the same breath. Her dark hair was styled sleek and straight, parted severely to one side, framing a face that held both refined beauty and something harder, something forged through years of reconstructing what betrayal had shattered. At 26, she had learned that poise could be both armor and weapon, depending on who was watching and what they wanted to see. Tonight, she preferred to be professional, to execute her curatorial duties and retreat before the networking became performative grief. 4 years had passed since Robert Bonnet had ended their engagement with the calculated cruelty of someone discarding a failed investment. 4 years since he had sat across from her at the restaurant she'd chosen for their anniversary and explained, with the patient condescension of someone correcting a child's math homework, that she was too focused on her little art projects, too emotionally demanding, too fundamentally insufficient for the life he intended to build. He had been sleeping with her younger sister Victoria for 11 months by then, though Kathleen wouldn't discover this until 3 weeks later, when Victoria announced her pregnancy at their parents' Sunday dinner. Robert had moved on to someone who came with the correct family connections, someone whose last name appeared on hospital wings and university buildings, someone whose tears were decorative rather than inconvenient. And Kathleen's family had chosen Victoria, chosen the grandchild over the daughter who'd been wronged, chosen to rewrite the narrative so that Kathleen's coldness and career obsession had driven Robert away, so that Victoria's betrayal became a love story too, powerful to resist. But Kathleen had rebuilt. She had reconstructed herself in private, without the theatrical public processing or the social media declarations of healing that seemed obligatory in her generation. She had taken a position with Brett Capital Management initially as a junior art acquisitions consultant, brought on to authenticate a disputed Caravaggio that Randall Brett had purchased through questionable channels. She had told him bluntly it was a forgery, a good one, but fake nonetheless, and had expected to be fired or worse. Instead, he had laughed, a genuine sound of delighted surprise, and asked if she'd be willing to prevent him from making such expensive mistakes in the future. Within 2 years, she had become essential to him, managing not just his art investments and gallery operations, but occasionally glimpsing the darker enterprises where his real power resided. The money that flowed through legitimate businesses with impeccable paperwork and illegal origins that were never quite provable. She knew what he was. Everyone in Manhattan with any real awareness knew what Randall Brett was. The quiet king of New York's underworld. The man who controlled territory through strategy rather than spectacle, whose violence was surgical and whose loyalty was absolute. But he had treated her with a respect Robert never had, valued her expertise as much as her discretion, and paid her enough that she had begun rebuilding not just her confidence, but her independence. More than that, he had never asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was, brilliant, damaged, and determinedly honest in a world built on beautiful lies. The crowd shifted near the gallery entrance, a ripple of attention that signaled someone significant had arrived. Kathleen glanced up from the Pollock and felt her carefully maintained composure fracture. Robert Bonnet moved through the gathering with the easy confidence of inherited wealth, his tailored black suit impeccable, his brown hair styled with the kind of careless precision that required expensive maintenance. He had aged well, she noted, with the clinical objectivity of someone no longer invested in his validation. The woman on his arm, Victoria, 6 months pregnant and glowing with smug contentment, was everything Kathleen had expected. All cultivated beauty and practiced grace, the kind of woman who understood that marriage to a Bonnet was a performance with contractual obligations. And in Robert's hand, held with deliberate visibility, was a red velvet ring box. Their eyes met across the gallery. Kathleen saw the moment recognition flickered through Robert's expression, followed immediately by calculation, and something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. She had changed since their last encounter, she knew. The softness he had criticized was gone, replaced by a composed strength that came from surviving his betrayal and emerging sharper, more dangerous for it. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to show she was unafraid, short enough to deny him the satisfaction of rattling her, then deliberately turned back to her champagne. She felt him approach before she saw him, that particular displacement of air that came with unwanted attention and unresolved history. Kathleen? His voice carried the same smooth confidence it always had, as if the past 4 years had been a brief intermission, rather than the destruction of her entire life. I wasn't expecting to see you here. I heard you were working as some kind of gallery assistant? The diminishment was intentional, the verbal equivalent of patting her head while holding an engagement ring meant for her sister. Kathleen took a slow sip of champagne before responding, using the pause to center herself, to remember that she was no longer the woman who had believed his lies. Lead curator at the Artemis Gallery, she corrected, her voice carrying the pleasant neutrality of someone discussing weather rather than wounds. And primary art acquisitions consultant for Brett Capital Management, though I suppose you're still building your real estate empire on your father's reputation and his political connections. Robert's smile tightened at the edges, the first crack in his performance. Victoria, who had been examining the Pollock with studied disinterest, looked up sharply, her hand drifting protectively to her rounded belly. This is Victoria Bonnet, Robert said, the shared surname doing exactly the work he intended. A reminder of what Kathleen had lost, what Victoria had won. We're married now, I'm sure you heard. Victoria, this is Kathleen. Well, I suppose we were engaged once, weren't we? Before you decided your career was more important than... Before Kathleen could respond, before she could summon the cutting reply that was building behind her professional mask, she felt a presence materialize at her side, solid and commanding, in a way that made Robert's posturing look like amateur theater. Randall Brett had moved through the crowd with the silence of an apex predator, and now he stood close enough that Kathleen could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask something darker, something dangerous beneath the civilized surface. Gilpin, Randall said, his voice carrying the faint rasp of someone who'd grown up in Brooklyn before money smoothed his edges. Smooth as aged bourbon, and just as intoxicating. Kathleen Gilpin, though I prefer to think of her as the most brilliant acquisitions expert in New York, rather than catalogued by whatever relationship history you're attempting to weaponize. His hand settled on Kathleen's waist with casual possession, the touch burning through the thin fabric of her dress, his palm pressing directly over the small of her back in a way that was both protective and claiming. Randall Brett. I don't believe we've met, though I recognize you from the society pages, Bonnet Developments, correct? Your father's company. The emphasis on father's was subtle but devastating, a single word that reduced Robert to exactly what he was, inherited privilege masquerading as earned success. Robert's face colored slightly as he registered not just the implicit insult, but the much more pressing reality of who was delivering it. Everyone in Manhattan knew who Randall Brett was and what he was. The man who stood before them now looked like he belonged at gallery openings. His navy suit tailored perfectly to his athletic frame, his dark hair styled back from a face that could have belonged in a Renaissance painting, if not for the cold intelligence in his dark eyes and the hint of ink that marked his neck, disappearing beneath his collar in patterns that suggested violence and loyalty in equal measure. His hands, one now resting possessively on Kathleen's waist, the other hanging loose at his side, bore subtle scars across the knuckles, and a simple silver ring on his right hand that caught the light with deliberate menace. "Mr. Brett," Robert said, recovering his composure with visible effort, the ring box suddenly feeling less like a weapon and more like evidence of his own miscalculation. "Of course, your reputation precedes you." "I'm certain it does," Randall said, his smile all edges, nothing warm in it, nothing civilized about the predatory focus in his eyes. "Kathleen was just about to tell me about an old acquaintance who once made the catastrophic mistake of underestimating her value. Someone who confused her kindness for weakness, her competence for compliance." His fingers traced a small, deliberate circle against Kathleen's spine, invisible to others, earth-shattering to her. "I've been curious about the fool who was stupid enough to let her go ever since she mentioned him. I'm pleased to finally put a face to the failure." The moment hung suspended, civilized and violent in equal measure, the prelude to something that would change everything. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Now, back to the story. The weight of Randall's presence had been a constant throughout the evening, a gravitational pull Kathleen had learned to navigate over 3 years of careful professionalism. She'd felt his eyes tracking her movements as she'd guided potential buyers through the exhibition, explained provenance to collectors who cared more about investment potential than artistic merit, ensured the champagne flowed, and the conversations remained appropriately sophisticated. He watched her the way predators watched territory they'd already claimed, but hadn't yet marked, and she had pretended not to notice because acknowledging it would require confronting truths. Neither of them had been willing to speak aloud. Until now. Robert's voice carried that same patronizing warmth he'd always used when he wanted to feel magnanimous. "I'm genuinely happy you found this." He gestured vaguely at the gallery walls, the champagne flutes, the carefully curated chaos of opening night. "It must be fulfilling, in its way. Playing with paintings, though I imagine the pay can't compare to real work." He paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable. "Victoria and I were just discussing how we should support the arts more. Perhaps Bonnet Developments could sponsor one of your little exhibitions? A tax write-off that actually does some good?" Victoria, her sister, her betrayer, her replacement, stood slightly behind Robert with one hand resting on her pregnant belly in that universal gesture of smug maternal superiority. She wore cream, all soft edges and expensive simplicity, the kind of outfit that whispered old money and good breeding. Her smile was sympathetic in the way that felt like a slap, all surface concern masking deeper satisfaction. "That's generous, Robert," Kathleen said, her voice steady despite the rage building behind her ribs. Though the Artemis Gallery tends to work with patrons who have earned rather than inherited their fortunes, we find they have better taste. The shift in Robert's expression was subtle but unmistakable. A tightening around his eyes, a slight discoloration across his cheekbones that spoke to wounded ego and barely restrained contempt. He opened his mouth to respond, and Kathleen braced herself for whatever diminishment he'd prepared, whatever verbal knife he'd sharpened during their years apart. But the words never came. Randall appeared between them with the kind of fluid menace that made people instinctively step back, a displacement of air and authority that transformed the space from civilized to dangerous without a single word spoken. He was taller than Robert, broader, carrying the kind of physical presence that came from genuine violence rather than gym memberships and inherited confidence. The crowd around them had gone quiet, conversations dying mid-sentence as people registered who had just inserted himself into this particular interaction. "Robert Bonnet," Randall said, and it wasn't a question. His voice carried the same measured calm he used during business negotiations that ended with people agreeing to things they'd never intended. "I was hoping we'd meet. I've been curious about the man stupid enough to undervalue Kathleen's worth." His hand moved to Kathleen's waist, not asking permission, simply claiming space that had always been his by right, even if neither of them had acknowledged it. Though I suppose when you've built nothing yourself, recognizing actual competence becomes difficult. Robert's face flushed darker. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "We haven't. But I know quite a bit about you." Randall's smile was all teeth, nothing warm, behind it. "Bonnet Developments, 17 properties in Manhattan, most of them acquired through your father's connections to the Zoning Commission. Commissioner Chen, specifically, the one currently under federal investigation for accepting bribes. I imagine that investigation getting more comprehensive would be inconvenient for your portfolio." The threat hung in the air like smoke, visible to everyone close enough to hear, impossible to ignore. Victoria's hand tightened on Robert's arm, her expression shifting from smug to uncertain as she registered exactly who her husband had decided to antagonize. "Mr. Brett," Robert said, and Kathleen heard the calculation behind his careful tone, the recalibration of someone who'd just realized he'd walked into a trap. "I'm sure we can discuss—" "We're not discussing anything." Randall's other hand disappeared into his jacket, and when it reappeared, he was holding a knife. Not the kind of decorative weapon men carried for show, but something practical and brutal, the blade catching gallery lights in ways that suggested it had been used for more than opening letters. Security guards stood frozen at their posts, making no move to intervene, their inaction more telling than any announcement could be about who really controlled this space. Kathleen's breath stopped somewhere between her lungs and her throat, as Randall turned the blade against his own palm, pressing down with deliberate precision. Blood welled dark and immediate, pooling in the cup of his hand before sliding between his fingers in thin rivulets that looked black under the Edison bulbs. "In my world," Randall said, his eyes never leaving Kathleen's face, "we don't make claims with words. Words are cheap. They break too easily." He reached for her hand, his blood-slicked fingers wrapping around her wrist with surprising gentleness. "Give me your hand, Kathleen. Choose this. Choose me." She should have been horrified, should have pulled away, should have screamed or fainted, or done any of the things that civilized society expected when confronted with violence in galleries that smelled of champagne and money. Instead, she felt something unlock in her chest, something that had been clenched tight since Robert had looked at her across that anniversary dinner table and explained all the ways she wasn't enough. Kathleen placed her palm in Randall's outstretched hand. The cut was swift, precise, burning cold before it burned hot. She watched her own blood mix with his, their hands pressed together in a grip that transcended anything as simple as holding on. Randall's fingers laced through hers, binding them palm to palm, life to life, in a way that felt ancient and irrevocable and absolutely right, despite every rational thought screaming that this was madness. Then he pulled her against him, close enough that she could feel his heartbeat thundering against her breasts, could smell copper and expensive cologne and something darker beneath. Both. And kissed her. His mouth was demanding and possessive, claiming her with the kind of thorough certainty that left no room for doubt or hesitation. Their mingled blood smeared across both their lips, metallic and visceral, marking them both with evidence of this binding that no civilized contract could match. The gallery had gone completely silent, 100 witnesses frozen in shocked observation, phones raised to capture what would become legend or scandal, depending on who was telling the story. When Randall finally pulled back, not far, just enough to speak, his voice carried through the silence with perfect clarity, pitched for Robert, but meant for everyone. Let him witness the woman he betrayed. His thumb traced her blood-stained lower lip with devastating tenderness, a gesture so intimate it felt more exposing than the kiss itself. Let him understand what he discarded. Let him spend the rest of his insignificant life knowing that his greatest achievement was being too stupid to recognize value when it was standing right in front of him. Kathleen watched Robert's face contort through shock, rage, humiliation, and something that might have been belated understanding. Victoria had started crying, quiet, hitching sobs that spoke to genuine distress rather than performance, and someone in the crowd had their phone raised, capturing every moment of this public unraveling. But Kathleen didn't care about the witnesses or the scandal or the video that would be viral by midnight. She cared about the blood drying between her fingers, where they were still laced with Randall's, about the way he held her like she was both precious and powerful, about the fact that for the first time in 4 years she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, even if that place was dangerous, even if it cost her everything safe and acceptable, especially then. The gallery had become a tableau of frozen shock, every face turned toward them like flowers tracking sun, except there was nothing warm about this attention. It was hungry and appalled in equal measure, the kind of witnessing that would fuel gossip for months and reshape social hierarchies with a single viral video. Kathleen could taste copper on her lips where Randall's blood mingled with hers, could feel the ache in her palm where the knife had opened her skin with surgical precision, could sense the exact moment when her old life ended and something new, dangerous and irrevocable, began. Randall's hand remained clasped with hers, their palms pressed together in a grip that transcended simple touch. Blood seeping between their fingers in ways that should have been horrifying, but felt instead like completion. His other hand cupped her face, thumb tracing her cheekbone with the kind of reverence that contrasted sharply with the violence he'd just performed, the duality of him, brutal and tender, claiming and worshipping, laid bare for everyone to see. "If you want to walk away," he said, quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear beneath the rising murmur of the crowd. "I'll make this look like performance, like protection theater. I'll tell them I was defending my consultant from harassment, that the blood oath was intimidation tactics to get Robert to back off." His dark eyes searched hers with an intensity that felt like being seen at a molecular level. "You can go back to your professional life, your safe boundaries, your careful distance. I'll give you that exit if you need it." But even as he offered escape, his hand tightened fractionally around hers, his thumb pressing against her racing pulse in a way that suggested he knew exactly what her answer would be before she spoke it aloud. Kathleen glanced past his shoulder at the wreckage of her former life. Robert stood frozen in impotent rage, his face mottled red and white in patterns that would have been comical if they weren't so viscerally satisfying. The engagement ring he'd brought for Victoria, that calculated prop meant to demonstrate his complete victory, sat forgotten in its velvet box on a nearby table, abandoned when his carefully constructed narrative had collapsed. Victoria had sunk onto a bench, one hand pressed to her pregnant belly, while the other covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face in a display that Kathleen recognized as genuine distress, rather than manipulation for once. Her parents would be calling soon, demanding explanations, choosing sides the way they always did, and Kathleen already knew which daughter they'd support. She should care about that. Should feel something about burning these bridges so thoroughly there would be no rebuilding them. But all she felt was a strange, fierce liberation, the kind that came from finally stopping the exhausting performance of trying to be enough for people who would never see her value. "What does it mean?" she asked, her voice steady despite everything. "The blood oath. In your world, what does this actually mean?" Randall's expression shifted, something ancient and serious replacing the controlled menace he'd worn like armor. "It means you're mine, and I'm yours until death. Any threat to you is war against me, and any enemy of mine becomes yours to face. It can't be broken, Kathleen, not by distance, not by time, not by regret." His blood-stained thumb traced her lower lip with devastating gentleness. "It can only be honored or avenged. Once bound by blood, we're bound forever. In my world, this is more permanent than any marriage, more sacred than any contract. This is choosing someone completely, darkness and all." The weight of that permanence should have terrified her, should have sent her running back to the safe mediocrity of a life where men like Robert set the terms and women like her accepted them with grace. But 4 years of rebuilding herself in silence had taught Kathleen something essential. Safety was an illusion, and the only real choice was whose darkness you were willing to face. She looked at Robert again, really looked at him, and saw not the man who'd broken her, but the catalyst who'd freed her from a life of performing worthiness for people who would never grant it. Saw Victoria not as the sister who'd betrayed her, but as the woman who'd done her an unintentional favor by revealing exactly how conditional her family's love had always been. Saw the gathered crowd not as judges whose opinion mattered, but as witnesses to the moment she stopped apologizing for taking up space. "Then let them witness," Kathleen said clearly, loudly enough that her voice carried through the gallery's shocked silence. She pressed her bleeding palm more firmly against Randall's, feeling the warm slick of mingled blood between their fingers. "I choose this. I choose you. Not despite what you are, but including it. All of it." Something fierce and triumphant flared in Randall's eyes before he kissed her again, briefer this time but no less claiming, a seal on the choice she'd just made in front of everyone who'd ever doubted her strength. When he pulled back, he laced their fingers together and turned them both toward the exit. "Then let's go home." Robert found his voice as they moved past him, the words erupting in a cocktail of rage and desperation. "You think you've won? You think binding yourself to a criminal makes you special?" His voice rose to a shout that echoed off the gallery's high ceilings. "I'll expose you both. I'll tell everyone what he is, what you've become. You'll regret this, Kathleen. You'll see what you've—" Randall didn't pause, didn't even glance back, but his voice cut through Robert's tirade like a blade through silk. "Try it. See what happens when you threaten what belongs to me." They walked through the gallery's glass doors into Manhattan's humid evening, leaving behind the whispers and the photographs and the life Kathleen had spent 4 years outgrowing. Her phone began vibrating in her clutch immediately, her mother's number flashing, then her father's, then Victoria's, a cascade of incoming judgment that she declined with steady fingers, each rejection another bridge burning behind her. Randall's car waited at the curb, black, armored, expensive in ways that had nothing to do with luxury and everything to do with survival. The driver opened the door without comment, his face carefully neutral, even as his eyes tracked the blood on their joined hands. Inside, the leather seats were soft, and the privacy glass was already raised, cocooning them in sudden quiet after the gallery's chaos. Kathleen finally looked at her palm, really examined what Randall had done. The cut was clean and precise, deep enough to scar but not to damage, a permanent mark that would fade to silver over time, but never disappear completely. Already it had stopped bleeding actively, though her skin remained tacky with drying blood. Randall reached for a first aid kit tucked beneath the seat, because of course he kept medical supplies in his car, and began cleaning her hand with surprising gentleness. His own palm still bled sluggishly, but he attended to hers first, his touch careful and reverent as he applied antiseptic that stung sharp and bright, before wrapping her hand in pristine white gauze. "No regrets?" he asked quietly, his eyes meeting hers in the dim interior light as he worked. Kathleen thought about Robert's face, about Victoria's tears, about her phone still vibrating with family demands she would never answer. Thought about the video already spreading through social media, about her reputation in the legitimate art world, about every safe thing she was trading for this dangerous, complicated, absolutely real connection. "Only that you waited 3 years to claim me," she answered honestly, watching his expression transform with satisfaction and relief and something deeper that might have been love or might have been the beginning of it. Randall finished bandaging his own hand, then pulled her close across the leather seat, careful of their matching wounds. "I wanted you healed first," he admitted against her hair. "Wanted you strong enough to choose me rather than just desperate enough to accept rescue." "I chose you," Kathleen corrected, pressing her bandaged palm against his chest, where she could feel his heart racing. "Not rescue, not safety. You, all of you." The car pulled away from the gallery, carrying them toward whatever came next, and Kathleen didn't look back even once. The penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a building in Tribeca that looked unremarkable from the street, exactly the kind of deliberate anonymity that wealth bought when it wanted to hide in plain sight. The elevator required both a key card and fingerprint scan, and Kathleen noticed the subtle camera angles that covered every approach, the reinforced steel behind decorative panels, the way the glass walls overlooking Manhattan's glittering sprawl were too thick to be merely architectural preference. This wasn't just a home. It was a fortress built to withstand siege. But inside, past the security systems and armed guards who nodded deferentially as Randall led her through, it was unexpectedly beautiful. The art she'd helped him acquire over 3 years lined the walls, a genuine Rothko that pulsed with color, a Basquiat that captured controlled chaos, the Modigliani she'd authenticated last winter. Books filled custom shelves, their spines worn in ways that suggested actual reading rather than decorative purchasing. A chess set sat on a side table mid-game, as if Randall played against himself in quiet moments, strategizing even in leisure. It was evidence of a man who was more than violence, more than the reputation that preceded him like a shockwave. Evidence that he thought, that he felt, that somewhere beneath the calculated menace was someone who appreciated beauty and complexity in equal measure. Randall watched her take it all in, still holding her bandaged hand, his thumb tracing circles against her wrist where her pulse hammered. "I need to show you something," he said finally, "before this goes further, before you're in too deep to surface." He led her to his office, a room dominated by a massive desk and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city like a kingdom waiting to be ruled. He pulled up files on his computer with practiced efficiency, showing her the legitimate businesses first. Brett Capital Management, the art investment firm where she officially worked. Real estate holdings, import-export companies with impeccable paperwork and quarterly profits that would satisfy any auditor. Then he showed her what lived beneath. The loan operations that charged interest rates the law would call usurious. The protection rackets disguised as private security contracts. The money laundering channels that flowed through every legitimate business he owned, turning dirty cash into clean assets through transactions so complex they'd require a forensic accountant months to untangle. The weapons trafficking that moved through his import companies hidden among legal cargo. The network of loyalty and fear he'd built over 15 years, held together by strategic generosity and surgical violence in exact proportion. "This is what I am," Randall said, his voice devoid of apology or justification. "This is what you've bound yourself to. The blood oath doesn't just make you mine, it makes you complicit in everything I do. Every decision I make, every line I cross, you're part of it now. By choosing me, you're choosing all of this." He closed the laptop, his expression serious in ways she'd rarely seen. "Know what you've chosen, Kathleen. Know what loving me costs before you're too invested to walk away." Kathleen studied him in the office's low light. This man who'd just shown her every secret that could destroy him, who'd opened himself completely despite the risk, despite the vulnerability it created. "Why did you wait 3 years?" she asked. You could have claimed me any time. Why now? Something shifted in Randall's expression, a crack in the armor she'd never seen before. Because 3 years ago, you walked into my office with a Caravaggio I'd paid $2 million for, and you told me within 5 minutes it was a fake. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. My advisors were terrified. They'd authenticated it, vouched for it, and here was this junior consultant calling it a forgery. They thought I'd have you fired. Maybe worse. But you laughed, Kathleen remembered. I laughed because you didn't fear me. Everyone else in my life, they lie or they hedge or they tell me what I want to hear because they're afraid of consequences. But you told me truth. His hand came up to cup her face, his bandaged palm rough against her cheek. I've loved you since that moment. Since you stood in my office and refused to be anything other than exactly who you are. Brilliant, honest, unafraid to call me on my mistakes. He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers in a gesture that felt more intimate than any kiss. I waited because you were broken when we met. Robert had shattered something essential in you, and I needed you whole before I could claim you. I needed you strong enough to choose me rather than just accept rescue. I needed you to come to me as an equal, not as someone I'd saved. I'm not broken anymore, Kathleen said, her free hand fisting in his shirt. No, Randall agreed, his voice dropping to something rough and wanting. You're not. When he kissed her this time, there was no audience, no performance, no blood oath to seal. Just hunger and recognition and 3 years of denied wanting finally given permission to surface. He backed her against the desk, his hands finding the zipper of her burgundy gown with practiced efficiency. And she reached for his shirt buttons with fingers that trembled only slightly as she revealed the ink that marked his chest. A dragon coiled around his heart, intricate and beautiful and violent in equal measure. They shed clothes with increasing urgency, each revelation of skin feeling like another truth spoken. When Randall lifted her onto the desk, his bandaged hand pressed against her bandaged palm in a grip that sent sparks of pain through the cut, and somehow transformed that pain into something else entirely. Their binding, always present, a constant reminder that this wasn't just physical, it was the consummation of something ancient and permanent. He moved into her with a care that bordered on reverence, watching her face with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and cherished. Their bandaged hands remained clasped throughout, pressed between their bodies as they moved together. Blood calling to blood even through layers of gauze. It was claiming and worship and homecoming all at once, the kind of intimacy that changed you on a cellular level because you couldn't give yourself this completely to another person without being fundamentally altered in the process. When Kathleen came apart, it was with Randall's name on her lips and her hand fused to his, and she felt something in her chest unlock that she hadn't known was caged. She woke to morning light filtering through bulletproof glass, her palm throbbing with each heartbeat in a way that should have concerned her, but instead felt like proof, evidence that last night had been real, that she'd crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. Randall slept beside her, one arm thrown across her waist even in sleep, as if afraid she might disappear. His face relaxed in ways it never was when he was awake. She studied the scars on his knuckles, the ink that marked his skin, all the evidence of a life lived in violence and shadow. She should feel fear, she thought. Should be spiraling into regret about the bridges she'd burned, the family she'd lost, the legitimate career she'd compromised. Should be questioning whether passion and blood oaths were sufficient foundation for a life that now included complicity in weapons trafficking and money laundering. But all she felt was relief. The exhausting performance was finally over. The endless work of trying to be enough for people who would never see her value, who would always find her wanting, because the problem had never been her insufficiency, but their inability to recognize worth when it stood before them. She'd spent 4 years rebuilding herself in silence, proving her competence to everyone except herself. Last night, bound by blood and claimed in front of witnesses, she'd finally stopped performing and started living. Her phone sat on Randall's nightstand, powered off since they'd arrived. She knew what waited when she turned it on. Her mother's disappointment, her father's demands that she fix this, Victoria's tears, Robert's threats, dozens of messages from people who'd suddenly developed strong opinions about her choices. The legitimate art world would distance itself from her. Society would judge. Her old life would close its doors permanently. And she found she didn't care. Didn't need their approval or their acceptance or their carefully curated version of respectability that demanded she shrink herself to fit spaces too small for who she'd become. Randall stirred beside her, his eyes opening with immediate alertness despite the early hour. "Regrets?" he asked, as if the question itself was a morning ritual, something he'd need to confirm repeatedly until he trusted her answer. Kathleen pressed her bandaged palm against his chest, feeling his heart beat steady and strong beneath her hand. "None," she said simply. "Only relief that I finally stopped pretending I belonged anywhere except here." He pulled her close, careful of their matching wounds, and kissed her with the same thoroughness he'd shown everything else. Complete, claiming, absolutely certain. And Kathleen, for the first time in 4 years, felt like she'd finally come home. The video went viral within 12 hours. Randall cutting their palms, the blood oath kiss, Robert's face contorting through shock and rage, all captured in crystalline detail by a dozen phones and shared across every social media platform with increasingly dramatic captions. By morning, it had been viewed 3 million times, dissected by strangers who had opinions about violence and romance, and whether Kathleen was brave or delusional, for binding herself to a man whose reputation preceded him like a warning shot. Kathleen watched the fallout from Randall's penthouse, her bandaged palm throbbing as she scrolled through messages she had no intention of answering. Her mother had called 17 times. Her father had left voicemails that progressed from concerned to furious to coldly disappointed. Victoria's texts were poison wrapped in sisterly concern, each one a masterclass in passive-aggressive manipulation, disguised as care. What she hadn't expected was the black sedan that followed her to the Artemis Gallery 3 days later, or the woman in a pristine suit who approached her in the gallery's back office with a federal badge and an expression that suggested she'd seen too much of humanity's worst impulses to be surprised by anything anymore. "Ms. Gilpin, I'm Special Agent Sarah Chen, FBI." The badge was real, the authority unmistakable. "I'd like to ask you a few questions about your relationship with Randall Brett and your role as a consultant for Brett Capital Management." Kathleen's pulse stuttered, but her face remained calm. Years of curating exhibitions for demanding collectors having taught her how to mask reactions. "I'm afraid I can't discuss client business without clearance from our legal department." Chen smiled, thin and knowing. "We've already spoken with Mr. Brett's attorneys. They're aware of this conversation." She set a folder on Kathleen's desk, opening it to reveal documentation that made her stomach drop. Art appraisals she'd completed over 3 years, each one legitimate on its surface but highlighted now in ways that revealed the pattern beneath. Paintings purchased through Brett Capital for amounts that didn't quite match market value. Transactions that coincided with large cash deposits from sources that disappeared into corporate shells when investigated. "You're very good at your job," Chen said. "The appraisals are professionally executed, completely defensible. But they're also part of a sophisticated money laundering operation that's been running through Brett's legitimate businesses for years." She leaned forward, her expression shifting to something that might have been genuine concern if Kathleen hadn't known better. "I don't think you understood what you were participating in when you started. I think Randall Brett recruited you because you're brilliant and because you were vulnerable after what Robert Bonnet did to you." The mention of Robert sent ice through Kathleen's veins. "What does Robert have to do with this?" "He provided us with the initial documentation. Came to my office 4 days ago claiming he was concerned about your welfare, that he'd seen you fall under Brett's influence and wanted to help you escape before you were in too deep." Chen's smile turned sympathetic in ways that made Kathleen's skin crawl. He gave us enough to open an investigation. And that blood oath video? That's evidence of coercion, Ms. Gilpin. We can protect you. Testify against Brett. Tell us what you know about his operations, and we'll put you in witness protection. New identity, new city, a chance to escape this life before it destroys you. Kathleen looked at the evidence spread across her desk, at the careful documentation of 3 years of work that she'd done knowing exactly what it was for, then back at Chen's face with its practiced compassion and underlying steel. I'd like to speak with my attorney before answering any questions, she said quietly. 2 hours later, she sat in a conference room with Randall's lead counsel, a man named Marcus Chen, who bore no relation to the FBI agent, but shared her razor-sharp intelligence, while Agent Chen laid out her case again with the addition of threatened prosecution if Kathleen didn't cooperate. Ms. Gilpin is an art expert, not a money laundering specialist, Marcus said when Chen finished. She completed legitimate appraisals for legitimate transactions. If some of Mr. Brett's business associates use those appraisals for illegal purposes, that's hardly her responsibility. She's his mistress, Chen countered. She knows what he is. That video makes it clear. That video, Kathleen interrupted, her voice cutting through the legal posturing, shows me making a choice. An informed, deliberate choice to bind myself to Randall Brett. I'm not a victim, Agent Chen. I'm not being coerced or manipulated or deceived. I know exactly who he is and what he does, and I chose him anyway. Chen's expression hardened. Then you're complicit in his crimes. I can prosecute you alongside him. With what evidence? Marcus asked. Appraisals that any court would recognize as professionally executed? Speculation about her personal relationship? You have nothing concrete, Agent Chen, and we both know it. Without Ms. Gilpin's cooperation, your case collapses before it reaches a grand jury. The meeting ended with threats on both sides, but Kathleen walked out knowing she'd made herself clear. She wouldn't betray Randall, wouldn't testify, wouldn't play the role of rescued victim in whatever narrative the FBI was constructing. Her phone exploded as she left the federal building, her mother's number flashing repeatedly, then her father's, then Victoria's, in a cascade that felt orchestrated. She answered her mother's call on the 7th attempt. Kathleen, thank God. We've been trying to reach you. I know what you want, Kathleen interrupted. You want me to come home, to leave Randall, to pretend the last 3 days didn't happen. You want me to be the daughter who makes safe choices and doesn't embarrass the family. We want you safe. That man is dangerous, Kathleen. He's a criminal. Robert told us everything. Robert, Kathleen said, is a liar who destroyed me and then expected me to remain destroyed forever so he could feel powerful. And you believed him? You believed him 4 years ago when he blamed me for his infidelity, and you're believing him now when he pretends to care about my welfare. Your sister is devastated. The proposal was supposed to be... I don't care about Victoria's proposal. I don't care about her tears or her pregnancy or her feelings about a night that was never about her in the first place. She made her choice 4 years ago when she slept with my fiancé. I'm making mine now. She hung up before her mother could respond, then systematically blocked every family member's number. Each deletion another bridge burned and rebuilt behind her as something stronger. Victoria's text messages were the hardest to read, not because they hurt, but because they revealed how little her sister had ever truly known her. You stole my moment. You always have to be the center of attention. I hope you're happy ruining my life. Each message a masterpiece of narcissism wrapped in victimhood, as if Kathleen's entire existence should revolve around making Victoria's life easier. She blocked Victoria last, watching the number disappear from her phone with a finality that should have felt tragic, but instead felt like relief. When she returned to the penthouse, Randall was waiting in his office, his expression dark in ways that suggested violence barely contained. Robert posted a retraction, he said without preamble. Claimed he was mistaken about your involvement in my business, that he'd allowed personal feelings to cloud his judgment. He's left New York. Boston, according to my sources. Kathleen didn't ask what had happened during Randall's conversation with Robert. Didn't need the details of whatever threat or demonstration had convinced him that running was preferable to staying. She understood now that this was the cost of loving someone like Randall. The violence that happened in shadows to keep her safe. The blood that got spilled so hers didn't have to be. The FBI came to see me, she said instead. Agent Chen offered witness protection if I testified against you. Randall's expression went carefully blank. And I told her I wasn't a victim to be saved. Kathleen crossed to him, placing her bandaged hand against his chest where his heart hammered. I told her I made a choice knowing exactly what it meant. Something fierce and vulnerable flickered through Randall's eyes. You could have taken the deal, could have walked away clean. I don't want clean, Kathleen said. I want real. I want you. She took a breath, steadying herself for the truth she'd been carrying since the blood oath. I love you, Randall. Not despite the violence or the danger or the moral complexity of what you do. I love you, including all of it, because it's in service of protecting what you value, because you see me completely and still choose me, because loving you feels more honest than any safe choice I could make. Randall pulled her against him with barely restrained intensity, his face buried in her hair. I've loved you since you walked into my office 3 years ago and refused to lie to me, he said, his voice rough. Since you looked at me with no fear and perfect honesty when everyone else was terrified. You're the only real thing in my life, Kathleen. Everything else is strategy and performance, but you? Your truth. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the aftermath of burned bridges and federal investigations and family fractures that would never heal. And Kathleen understood that this was love in his world. Not safe or simple or approved by anyone who mattered to society, but absolutely real and worth every cost. Victor Constantine watched the Blood Oath video for the 3rd time, his expression thoughtful in ways that made his lieutenants nervous. He paused on the frame where Randall Brett's hand cradled Kathleen Gilpin's face, blood smearing both their lips in that ancient ritual that the old families still recognized, even if modern criminals had forgotten its significance. Irreversible, permanent. A declaration that made her not just his woman, but his most vulnerable asset. This is how we break him, Constantine said finally, his Russian accent thick with satisfaction. Not through territory or money, through her. The attack came on a Tuesday afternoon, when the Artemis Gallery was closed for installation. When Kathleen was alone in the back office reviewing acquisition proposals for a Kandinsky that may or may not have been stolen from a Munich museum in 1947. She'd grown accustomed to the subtle presence of Randall's security. 2 men who shadowed her movements without being intrusive, whose names she didn't know, but whose competence she trusted. They'd been there since the blood oath. Silent guardians she'd stopped noticing consciously, even though some part of her always registered their protection, which was why the silence felt wrong before she understood why. 3 men materialized in her office doorway with weapons drawn, not the theatrical guns from movies, but practical pistols held with the casual competence of people who'd used them before. The largest one smiled with too many teeth, his accent making consonants harsh where they should have been soft. Ms. Gilpin, Mr. Constantine sends his regards. He gestured with the gun, indicating she should stand. You're going to come with us quietly. No screaming, no fighting. Make this easy and maybe we send you back to your lover mostly intact. Kathleen's pulse hammered, but her mind remained eerily clear, cataloging details with the same analytical precision she used for authentication. 3 attackers meant Randall's security team was compromised or dead. The weapons were too professional to be amateurs. And the casual cruelty in that smile suggested these men had delivered pieces of people to their loved ones before, and would do so again without hesitation. Randall will kill you, she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Maybe, but first he'll cede territory to keep you alive. First he'll make concessions that weaken his empire. First, he'll bleed resources trying to find you while Constantine takes everything he's built. The man stepped forward. We're going to cut you up slow, pretty girl. Send him fingers, then hands, then... The window behind them exploded inward. What followed happened too fast for conscious thought. Randall's security team pouring through the shattered glass with their own weapons, the back office transforming into a war zone of close-quarters combat, where every shot risked hitting Kathleen, and therefore required precision, that exceeded normal human reaction time. She dropped behind her desk as ordered in training she'd received, without realizing it was training, covering her head while gunfire cracked like thunder in the confined space. 2 of Constantine's men went down immediately, eliminated with efficiency that spoke to extensive planning. But the third, the one who'd threatened her with systematic dismemberment, grabbed Kathleen by her hair, hauling her up as a shield with his gun pressed against her temple. Back off, or I paint the walls with her. Then Randall was there, appearing from somewhere Kathleen couldn't track, moving with violence so surgical it was almost beautiful. He caught the man's gun hand, twisted with leverage that sent the weapon clattering, and drove a knife, the same knife he'd used for the blood oath, up through the soft tissue beneath the jaw, in a thrust that stopped speech and breath and life simultaneously. The man collapsed, blood pooling dark and fast, and Randall was already turning to where the second attacker had risen, despite wounds that should have kept him down, desperate and dying, and determined to take someone with him. Kathleen watched Randall break the man's neck with his bare hands, the sound wet and final, watched him stand over the body with blood soaking his shirt and spattering his face, watched him transform from the man who'd held her gently into the weapon he'd been forged to be. Their eyes met across the office that smelled of cordite and copper, across bodies that had been men with thoughts and histories until 30 seconds ago. Kathleen waited for the horror to arrive, for the revulsion that should accompany watching someone kill with such practiced efficiency. Instead, she felt crystalline understanding. This wasn't violence for entertainment, or dominance, or proving something. This was survival. This was what happened when you built an empire in shadows, and someone tried to take what you'd claimed as yours. This was the cost of loving a man like Randall Brett. Not just accepting that he killed, but witnessing it, letting it be real instead of theoretical. She walked to him across the blood-stained floor, her hands reaching for his despite the gore that covered them. Are you hurt? Randall stared at her like he was seeing a ghost, like he'd expected her to run screaming, and couldn't quite process that she was touching him instead. Kathleen, are you hurt? She repeated, checking him for wounds with hands that shook only slightly. No, but you... His voice cracked, the first time she'd heard him sound anything other than absolutely controlled. You shouldn't have seen this, shouldn't have to... I knew what you were, Kathleen interrupted. I knew what the blood oath meant. This is part of it. This is the cost. She pressed her palm, the one that bore his mark, against his chest where his heart raced. I'm not running, Randall. I'm not horrified. I'm grateful you're fast enough and violent enough to keep me alive. He pulled her against him with desperate intensity, apparently unconcerned about the blood transfer, his face buried in her hair. Constantine declared war the moment he sent them. This won't be the last attempt. 2 hours later, Kathleen was being driven to a fortified estate in Westchester, surrounded by an armed convoy that moved through late afternoon traffic, with the kind of precision that suggested they'd done this before. The estate was beautiful. Stone walls and manicured grounds that disguised security measures, sophisticated enough to repel small armies. Armed men patrolled perimeters. Technology monitored every approach. This wasn't a home. It was a bunker. Randall hadn't come with her. He'd kissed her goodbye in the gallery parking lot, blood still on his clothes, his expression already hardening into the weapon he needed to be, to eliminate this threat permanently. 3 days? He'd said. Maybe 4. I'll send word when it's safe. Come back alive, she'd answered, and meant it more than any prayer she'd ever spoken. The first day passed in anxious pacing, unable to eat or focus, every sound potentially signaling either Randall's return or news of his death. Her phone received only coded messages, single words that meant he was alive, but told her nothing about what he was doing or how close he was to finishing this. The second day, she forced herself to read, to maintain some semblance of normalcy, even though her stomach churned with scenarios, her imagination constructed in vivid detail. Randall injured. Randall captured. Randall dead while she sat in safety he'd purchased with his life. The third day, she understood with devastating clarity that her life was no longer her own. Not because Randall had taken it, but because she'd given it freely when she pressed her bleeding palm to his. His survival had become more important than her safety. His existence more essential than her own. She'd bound herself to him completely, and that meant living with the constant awareness that the man she loved walked through violence as casually as other people walked through rain. On the evening of the third day, her phone buzzed with a message longer than the single-word confirmations. "It's done. Coming home. R." Kathleen read those 4 words 17 times, searching for subtext or injury reports, or any indication of what "it's done" actually meant. But all that mattered was the period after home, final, certain, alive. When Randall arrived 6 hours later, he looked exhausted in ways that went beyond physical tiredness, carrying weight that 3 days of violence had added to shoulders already bearing too much. But he was whole, breathing, standing in front of her. Kathleen crossed the distance between them and wrapped her arms around him without asking what he'd done or how many people had died to eliminate this threat. Those questions could wait. For now, she just held the man she loved and let herself feel the relief of his survival. "Constantine?" she asked finally. "Gone. His organization scattered. No one else will make the mistake of thinking you're my weakness." Randall pulled back enough to see her face, his expression fierce. "You're my strength, Kathleen. Never doubt that." She kissed him then, tasting exhaustion and violence and 3 days of separation, and understood that this was their life now. Periods of peace punctuated by danger. Intimacy earned through survival. Love that deepened precisely because it cost them both so much. Randall looked like he'd aged a decade in 3 days. The exhaustion written across his features went deeper than sleeplessness or physical exertion. It was the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd spent 72 hours making decisions that ended lives, calculating acceptable losses, becoming the weapon his empire required while the human parts of him withered under the strain. He stood in the fortified estate's doorway with dried blood under his fingernails and violence still clinging to him like cologne. And Kathleen understood that whatever he'd done to eliminate Constantine had cost him pieces of himself that might never grow back. She crossed to him without speaking, her hands reaching for his jacket to help him shed the physical weight, even if the psychological burden would take longer to lift. He had minor injuries, scraped knuckles, a cut along his jaw that would scar, bruising across his ribs that made him wince when she touched too firmly. But he was whole, breathing, alive when so many others weren't. "Bathroom," she said quietly, guiding him toward the estate's master suite. "Let me clean you up." He followed with the docility of someone too exhausted to argue, letting her undress him down to his boxers before settling him on the closed toilet lid while she gathered supplies. Under the bathroom's harsh light, the damage was more visible. Not just the fresh injuries, but the accumulation of violence written across his body in scars that told stories he'd probably never share. She worked in silence, cleaning cuts with antiseptic that made him hiss, checking the rib bruising for fractures that would require medical attention he'd refuse, her touch gentle but thorough. "I killed 14 men," Randall said finally, his voice rough with disuse and something darker. That's what it took to dismantle Constantine's operation completely. 14 men with families and histories and choices that led them to that moment when I decided they were acceptable losses to keep you safe. He looked up at her with eyes that held too much knowledge. "Does that number matter to you?" Would 15 have been too many? 10 too few? Kathleen paused in rapping his bruised knuckles, considering the question's weight. It matters that you're asking, she said finally. It matters that you're counting, that you're carrying this instead of dismissing it. But no, the specific number doesn't change anything. You eliminated a threat that would have kept coming. That's what I understand now. This isn't about justice or righteousness. It's about survival in a world where the rules are different than the ones I grew up with. I'm so tired, Randall admitted, the confession escaping like he hadn't meant to speak it aloud. Tired of war, of watching every shadow for threats, of calculating acceptable casualties and strategic responses, of being this. He gestured vaguely at himself, at the violence written in scars and fresh wounds. You make me want peace, Kathleen. Make me want to be something other than the weapon I've spent 20 years sharpening. She abandoned the first aid supplies to kneel between his legs, her hands framing his face with a gentleness that contrasted his brutality. Then let's build peace, together, in whatever ways we can. He kissed her palm, the one that bore his scar, with reverence that made her throat tight. Marry me. It wasn't a question, but neither was it a command. It hung in the air between them as something more essential, a need articulated with the same vulnerability he'd shown when admitting his exhaustion. I bound you with blood, Randall continued, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones as if memorizing her features. Claimed you in front of witnesses in the most permanent way my world recognizes. But I want more than that. I want to bind you with law, with my name, with everything I have to give. Be my wife, Kathleen. Not because you need protection, you've proven you don't need rescuing, but because I need you. Because you're the only person who's seen what I am and chosen me anyway. Kathleen felt something expand in her chest. Love and certainty, and the kind of peace that came from finally finding where you belonged, even if that place existed in shadows. Yes, she said simply. I didn't survive Robert's betrayal and family abandonment and FBI pressure just to play it safe now. I want this dangerous, complicated, absolutely real life with you. I want your name and your protection and your darkness. All of it. Relief transformed Randall's expression, vulnerability giving way to something fierce and possessive as he pulled her up into his lap despite his injuries, kissing her with the desperation of someone who'd spent 3 days unsure if he'd survive to ask the question. Soon, he murmured against her mouth. I want you married to me before the next threat materializes, before something else tries to take you from me. They planned the wedding with the same strategic precision Randall used for business negotiations, because in his world, a wedding was both celebration and vulnerability, gathering important people in one location, creating opportunities for enemies to strike. The guest list was ruthlessly curated. 15 members of Randall's inner circle, the men he trusted with his life and now hers. No extended family. No society connections. No photographers or publicity that could be weaponized. The ceremony would take place at the Westchester estate where they'd reunited, surrounded by security that could repel a small invasion force. Beautiful but strategic, romantic within the confines of survival. Kathleen chose a simple cream dress that wouldn't restrict movement if they needed to evacuate quickly. Randall would wear a suit with a shoulder holster concealed beneath the jacket, because love didn't make him careless, and marriage wouldn't change what he was. Traditional vows or custom? The officiant asked, a judge who owed Randall enough favors that he'd perform the ceremony without asking uncomfortable questions about why it needed to be secret. Simple, Randall said. The commitment's already made. This is just making it legal. The ceremony took place at sunset 3 weeks after the Constantine elimination, when Randall's intelligence network confirmed no immediate threats, and the estate's security had been reinforced to levels that bordered on paranoia. Kathleen walked toward him through a living room transformed into a chapel. No aisle or march or traditional performance. Just her crossing to him, with the same certainty she'd shown when accepting the blood oath. They faced each other before the judge with 15 armed men as witnesses, their hands clasped together palm to palm, so the matching scars pressed against each other through the ceremony. The judge spoke about commitment and partnership and legal bonds, but Kathleen barely heard the words. She was too focused on Randall's face, on the way he looked at her like she was both salvation and damnation, on the understanding that this moment was consecrating something that had already been sacred. When it came time for vows, they spoke simultaneously, the words simple and absolute. Until death. Beyond it, if possible. No elaborate promises, no flowery declarations about love conquering all or souls intertwining. Just the acknowledgement that they were bound completely, that death was the only acceptable ending, and that even death might not be sufficient to break what they'd forged. The judge pronounced them married, and Randall kissed her with the same possessive certainty he'd shown during the blood oath, claiming her legally now in addition to all the other ways he'd already claimed her. His men applauded, genuinely, despite their profession requiring cynicism, because they'd watched this relationship develop and understood that what Randall and Kathleen had built was rare enough to deserve celebration even in their violent world. That night, Kathleen lay beside her husband in the fortified estate's master bedroom, her wedding ring, a simple platinum band engraved with the date of the blood oath rather than the legal ceremony, catching moonlight as she traced Randall's sleeping features. She thought about the life she'd left behind, the family who'd chosen wrong, the career she'd compromised, all the bridges she'd burned to get here. And she felt nothing but profound gratitude that betrayal had led her to this. A marriage built on blood and truth, and the kind of love that survived because it had been tested by fire from the beginning. Mrs. Kathleen Brett, she thought, testing the name's weight and finding it fit perfectly. Randall stirred, his arm tightening around her waist even in sleep, and Kathleen let herself drift off, knowing she was exactly where she belonged. Claimed, married, bound by blood and law, to a man who would burn the world to keep her safe, and she would do the same for him. Marriage changed Kathleen in ways she hadn't anticipated, though perhaps she should have. The ring on her finger, platinum engraved with a date that mattered only to them, became a symbol that carried weight in rooms where power was currency and respect was earned through demonstration rather than demanded through title. When she walked into Randall's strategy meetings now, men who'd built empires on violence and fear stood until she sat, their deference genuine because they'd watched Randall demote a lieutenant for calling her decorative, and understood that disrespecting Mrs. Brett was equivalent to declaring war on her husband. The lieutenant in question, a man named Marcus, who'd worked for Randall for 8 years, had made his mistake 3 months into their marriage. Kathleen had been reviewing acquisition proposals for a collection of German expressionist paintings that would provide excellent cover for moving money from Eastern European accounts, and Marcus had remarked to another man that it was convenient having a pretty face to legitimize the operation, even if she doesn't understand what she's really facilitating. Randall had heard. Within an hour, Marcus was demoted from lieutenant to street-level collections, his authority stripped, his income reduced to a fraction of what he'd earned. The message rippled through the organization with the efficiency of gospel. Kathleen Brett wasn't decoration. She was power. Touch her with disrespect, and face consequences that would make you wish for the mercy of a quick death. Kathleen had watched this unfold with complicated feelings. Part of her appreciated the protection, the clear boundaries Randall established around her dignity. But another part, the part that still remembered being the woman Robert had diminished, wondered if she needed defending, or if she could have handled Marcus herself. She'd mentioned this to Randall that night, and he'd looked at her with those dark eyes that missed nothing. "You could have destroyed him with words," Randall had said. "You're capable of that and more. But in this world, my world, how I respond to threats against you tells everyone else where the lines are. Marcus needed to be an example. Not because you're weak, but because you're mine and everyone needs to understand what that means." So she'd accepted the demonstration. learned to read the deference in men's eyes when she entered rooms, discovered that power in Randall's empire came not just from fear but from association with someone who wielded fear with surgical precision. She attended meetings about territory disputes and loan portfolios, offered observations that came from her art expertise, but applied to their operations in ways that made strategic sense. She suggested using gallery exhibitions as meeting spaces where business could be conducted in plain sight under the guise of cultural appreciation. She advised on which politicians to cultivate and which to avoid based on social connections she'd maintained from her legitimate career. And she noticed, with increasing frequency, how easily violence had become acceptable in her calculations. When a rival operation tried to muscle in on Randall's protection territory, Kathleen's first thought wasn't about negotiation or legal recourse, but about elimination, the most efficient way to remove the threat permanently. When a business partner proved unreliable, she suggested leveraging his gambling debts rather than terminating the partnership cleanly. These solutions that would have horrified her 4 years ago now emerged from her mouth with clinical detachment, as if some fundamental part of her moral architecture had been rewired by proximity to Randall's world. She mentioned this to him 6 months into their marriage, lying in bed after lovemaking that had been both tender and possessive, his hand tracing idle patterns on her hip. "I'm not the same person anymore," she'd said quietly. "The woman Robert knew would be horrified by what I've become. Sometimes I look in the mirror and don't recognize who's looking back." Randall had been quiet for a long moment, his hand stilling on her skin. "Do you regret it? The change?" Kathleen had considered the question's weight, examining her transformation with the same analytical precision she used for art authentication. "No," she'd answered finally. "I grieve who I was, maybe, but I don't want her back. She was smaller, safer, more acceptable to people whose approval means nothing to me now." "You're not worse," Randall had said, pulling her closer. "You're just honest about what survival costs in this world. Most people have the luxury of never confronting that reality. We don't." Their marriage thrived despite, or perhaps because of, the darkness they inhabited together. Randall was present in ways Robert had never been, fully engaged in conversations about art and strategy and the small intimacies of daily life. He remembered how she took her coffee, asked about restoration projects she was consulting on, listened when she needed to process the moral complexity of decisions she'd participated in. He saw her completely. The curator and the criminal's wife. The woman who could authenticate a Kandinsky and suggest efficient ways to eliminate rivals, and loved all of it, without asking her to be less complicated for his convenience. But the costs accumulated in ways that couldn't be dismissed. Agent Chen appeared at the Artemis Gallery every few months, always with new questions, always with the same offer of witness protection and immunity, if Kathleen would just testify. The FBI pressure was low-level but persistent, a constant reminder that her choices had legal consequences that might eventually materialize as prosecution. Kathleen handled these encounters with practiced calm, referring Chen to Randall's attorneys and providing nothing except polite refusals. But the surveillance never quite disappeared. She'd learned to spot the unmarked cars, the agents who photographed her entering and leaving locations, the investigation that continued building even without her cooperation. Her legitimate art world contacts proved less persistent, but more painful. Gallery owners who'd once competed for her expertise now declined to return calls. Collectors who'd valued her eye for authenticity suddenly had other consultants they preferred working with. The curator network that had sustained her career gradually closed its doors, uncomfortable with her association with Randall Brett, and unwilling to risk their own reputations by maintaining contact. She received fewer invitations to exhibition openings, noticed herself excluded from professional organizations she'd once contributed to, watched her legitimate career opportunities shrink as her marriage became common knowledge. She grieved these losses. They represented years of work, relationships built on mutual respect for craft, a version of herself that had existed before blood oaths and strategic violence. But she didn't regret her choice. Authentic love in darkness felt more valuable than acceptable loneliness in light, and she'd rather be fully seen by one person than superficially accepted by hundreds. Randall noticed the isolation even when she didn't mention it. His awareness of her emotional state bordering on supernatural. He'd find her staring at emails declining collaboration, and he'd pull her into his arms without asking for explanations she couldn't articulate anyway. "You've lost a lot for me," he'd said once, his voice carrying guilt she hadn't expected. "I've gained more," Kathleen had countered, pressing her scarred palm against his chest. "I'd rather have this, complicated and dangerous and absolutely real, than the life I was supposed to want. That woman who fit perfectly in the art world? She was performing. I'm not performing anymore." 8 months into their marriage, Kathleen stood in Randall's office reviewing intelligence reports about a new operation in Red Hook. Her suggestions about approach and timing offered with the same confidence she'd once used discussing brush techniques and provenance. His men listened, considered, implemented her ideas because they'd learned she understood strategy in ways that translated across disciplines. She was no longer Randall's wife who sometimes offered input. She was integral to the operation. A voice that carried weight because she'd earned it through competence rather than demanded it, through association. She'd become the queen she hadn't known she was capable of being, ruling beside a king whose empire was built in shadows. And if that meant she'd lost the woman Robert had tried to keep small, if it meant her moral compass now pointed toward survival rather than acceptability, if it meant she'd traded legitimate career advancement for authentic power, she accepted those costs as the price of finally becoming who she was always meant to be. Randall crossed the office to stand behind her chair, his hands settling on her shoulders as they reviewed the intelligence together. This was their life now. Strategy meetings and security concerns, and love that deepened precisely because it survived in darkness. This was the marriage they'd built on blood oaths and legal bonds, on choosing each other repeatedly despite every cost. And Kathleen wouldn't trade it for anything the legitimate world could offer, because this, dangerous and complicated and absolutely hers, was finally home. Kathleen recognized the signs before she took the test. The exhaustion that coffee couldn't touch. The way certain smells made her stomach revolt. The tender heaviness in her breasts that signaled hormonal shifts she'd experienced once before in her early 20s, before a miscarriage had ended that possibility. She bought 3 tests from 3 different pharmacies, used them all at the fortified estate's master bathroom, while Randall was handling business in the city, and watched 3 positive results materialize like prophecies she wasn't certain she was ready to fulfill. 6 months since the blood oath kiss. 4 months married. And now carrying a child who would be born into a world where violence was currency, and loyalty was survival, and love was complicated by the constant awareness that any of them could die at any moment if enemies found the right vulnerability to exploit. She sat on the bathroom floor with the positive tests lined up on the tile, overwhelmed by joy and terror in equal measure. A child. Randall's child. A life they'd created together that would be beautiful and fierce and potentially targeted from birth simply because of whose blood flowed through their veins. The weight of that responsibility felt simultaneously impossible and inevitable, as if this pregnancy was the natural conclusion of binding themselves to each other so completely. She told him that night over dinner in the penthouse, the city glittering beyond bulletproof glass like a kingdom that belonged to them and threatened them in equal measure. Randall had cooked, something he did when he needed to think, his hands busy with chopping and searing, while his mind worked through strategic problems. She'd watched him move around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, this man who could kill with those same hands preparing food with surprising tenderness, and felt love so profound it was almost painful. "I'm pregnant," she said simply, setting her wine glass down, untouched, the gesture itself probably confirmation before the words landed. Randall went completely still, the knife he'd been using to slice bread frozen mid-motion. For 3 heartbeats, he didn't move, didn't breathe, and Kathleen watched emotions cascade across his face too quickly to catalog individually. Then pure, unguarded joy transformed his expression into something younger, lighter, more hopeful than she'd ever seen him. "Pregnant," he repeated, as if testing the word's weight. "We're having a baby." "We're having a baby," Kathleen confirmed, and watched joy give way to fear. Randall set the knife down carefully, his hands gripping the counter as if the granite could provide stability. His suddenly uncertain world couldn't. "I've brought you into danger?" he said quietly. "Into surveillance and threats and a life where agents photograph you at galleries and rivals look for weaknesses to exploit. And now we're bringing innocent life into it. A child who'll be targeted from birth, who'll grow up surrounded by armed guards and security protocols, who'll never have normal or safe or anything resembling what they deserve." He looked at her with eyes that held too much fear. "How do we justify that, Kathleen? How do I justify creating life knowing what it will cost them?" She crossed to him, her hands framing his face with the same gentleness he'd shown her countless times, her scarred palm pressing against his cheek. "We justify it by giving them what we found: unconditional love, fierce protection, and the strength to navigate whatever world they're born into. Our child will know they're valued completely. They'll understand that love means choosing someone despite costs, that family is built through loyalty rather than obligation, that real strength comes from facing darkness rather than pretending it doesn't exist." She pressed her forehead to his, breathing him in. "Our child will be safe because they'll have us, both of us, and we're formidable together." Randall pulled her against him with desperate intensity, his face buried in her hair, and she felt moisture on her neck that might have been tears, though he'd never admit it. "I'm terrified," he whispered, "more frightened than I've ever been facing any threat. Because this isn't something I can eliminate with strategy or violence. This is faith, Kathleen. Faith that we can keep them safe despite everything." "Then we have faith," she said simply. "Together." The pregnancy transformed Randall's protectiveness from careful to nearly unbearable. Security doubled overnight, 12 men instead of 6 shadowing Kathleen's movements, armed escorts even for trips from the penthouse to the car. He upgraded the estate's systems to levels that approached paranoia, installed panic rooms with medical supplies sufficient for emergency childbirth, hired an obstetrician who made house calls and asked no questions about why his patient required bulletproof glass between herself and examining rooms. He insisted Kathleen work from home, converting a sunlit room in the penthouse into an office where she could consult on acquisitions without exposure. Gallery visits required advanced security sweeps. Even grocery shopping, which she'd insisted on doing herself to maintain some normalcy, now involved 3-car convoys and pre-cleared routes. She tolerated it because she understood the fear driving his decisions, understood that vulnerability terrified him more than any rival ever had, that the pregnancy represented a weakness enemies could exploit in ways that keeping her safe suddenly seemed impossibly complicated. And she was right to understand, because the threats materialized with predictable efficiency. Agent Chen appeared at the penthouse building 2 weeks after Kathleen started showing, her expression sympathetic in ways that made Kathleen's skin crawl. "I heard congratulations are in order," Chen had said. "Have you thought about what kind of life you're giving this child? Growing up around violence and criminality? I can still offer protection, Ms. Brett, for you and the baby. A chance to raise them somewhere safe." Kathleen had looked at Chen with the same cool assessment she used for evaluating forgeries. "My child will be raised by parents who love them completely and would destroy anyone who tried to harm them. That's safer than most children get. Now leave before my husband's security removes you." But the FBI pressure was only part of the complication. Rival families who'd maintained cautious detente with Randall now eyed the pregnancy as potential leverage. Whispered threats reached through intermediaries. Intelligence reports showed increased surveillance. The calculus of power shifting because a child was simultaneously strength and vulnerability, depending on who controlled access. The world felt smaller, more dangerous, every public appearance a risk calculation that factored in not just Kathleen's safety, but the life growing inside her. They learned the baby's gender at 20 weeks. The ultrasound performed in a private medical suite Randall had essentially rented for the duration of her pregnancy. The technician, a woman named Sophia, who'd signed so many NDAs she probably couldn't discuss her grocery list, moved the wand across Kathleen's gel-covered belly, while grainy images appeared on the monitor. "There's the heartbeat," Sophia said, adjusting angles. "Strong and steady. Everything looks healthy." Kathleen watched the flutter on screen. Impossibly fast, impossibly real, and felt tears slide down her temples. That was their child. That rapid pulse was life they'd created together, proof that love could produce something beautiful, even in darkness. "Would you like to know the sex?" Sophia asked. "Yes," both Randall and Kathleen said simultaneously. "It's a boy," Sophia confirmed, angling the screen so they could see more clearly. "Congratulations. A boy. A son." Kathleen looked at Randall in the darkened room's blue light and saw tears streaming down his face unchecked, the first time she'd witnessed him cry openly. He stared at the monitor like it held divine revelation, one hand gripping Kathleen's with enough force to hurt, while the other pressed against the screen as if he could reach through technology to touch their son. "He's perfect," Randall whispered, his voice breaking. "He's perfect and small and vulnerable, and I don't know how to protect something that fragile." "The same way you protect everything you love," Kathleen said, squeezing his hand. "Completely, absolutely, with everything you have." They watched their son's heartbeat flutter on the monitor for long minutes after Sophia left them alone, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of creating life in a world that took it so easily. And Kathleen understood that this child, their boy, their son, already loved beyond measure, would be born into complexity that defied easy answers. But he would be born into love that transcended fear, protected by parents who'd chosen each other despite every cost, raised in a world where loyalty meant survival and family meant everything. That had to be enough. It had to be. At 7 months pregnant, Kathleen moved with the careful deliberation of someone carrying precious cargo through a world that wanted to drop it. Her body had transformed in ways that were both miraculous and uncomfortable. Her center of gravity shifted, her back ached constantly, and her son kicked with increasing frequency, as if practicing for the violence his bloodline would likely require. The prenatal appointment was routine, just another ultrasound to confirm what she already knew: that their boy was healthy, growing, preparing to be born into complexity that defied explanation to anyone who didn't live it. She'd gotten accustomed to the security escort that accompanied her everywhere now. 4 men in 2 cars, rotating positions with military precision, their presence both reassuring and suffocating. They swept the medical building before she entered, established sight lines, confirmed exits. Standard protocol for the wife of Randall Brett, especially when she carried his heir, which was why Robert's appearance in the parking garage shouldn't have been possible. He materialized between parked cars as Kathleen walked toward the exit, his appearance calculated to intercept her in the brief moment when her security detail had split. 2 men checking her car, 2 men holding the elevator. A window of vulnerability measured in seconds that Robert had apparently been watching for, waiting for, patient in ways he'd never been during their relationship. "Kathleen, please, I need to talk to you." He raised his hands in a gesture meant to convey harmlessness, but his desperation made him dangerous in ways he probably didn't understand. "Just 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." Her security team reacted immediately, weapons appearing with practiced efficiency, but Kathleen raised her hand in a gesture that meant wait. Not because she wanted to hear Robert's plea, but because she was curious what delusion had brought him here after months of silence, what fantasy he'd constructed that made approaching a heavily pregnant woman under armed guard seem reasonable. "You have 3 minutes, she said, her voice carrying the authority she'd earned in Randall's world. "Make them count." Robert's relief was palpable, his words tumbling out with the frantic energy of someone who'd rehearsed this speech too many times. "I've been in contact with FBI agent Chen. She has a witness protection offer. Real protection, Kathleen, not the kind that comes with armed guards and criminal empires. You and the baby. New identities, new city. A chance to escape before it's too late." He stepped closer, and her security team tensed but didn't intervene. "I can save you from him. From this life. Before he destroys you completely the way he destroys everything he touches." The presumption was almost impressive. That after everything, after the blood oath and the marriage and the obvious choice she'd made repeatedly, he still believed she needed saving. Still believed his salvation was preferable to the life she'd built deliberately, consciously, with full understanding of its costs. "I left Victoria," Robert continued, as if this confession should matter. "She left me first, actually, right after that video went viral. Couldn't handle being associated with my mistake of letting you go. I've spent months trying to fix this, trying to find a way back to you. Because I finally understand. You were the one, Kathleen. Not Victoria, not anyone else. You. And I threw that away because I was stupid and scared and couldn't see what was right in front of me." Kathleen studied him with the same analytical precision she used for authentication, cataloging the signs of his deterioration. He'd lost weight, his suit hanging slightly loose on a frame that had once been confident. His hair was styled differently, as if he'd been trying to reinvent himself. But his eyes held the same entitlement they always had, the same assumption that he deserved things simply because he wanted them. "This isn't about saving me," Kathleen said quietly. "This is about your ego. About the fact that I'm thriving without you, that I'm building a family with someone who actually sees me, that my life is fuller now than it ever was when we were together. You can't stand that your betrayal led to my happiness instead of my destruction. I'm offering you freedom. I have freedom. I have choice. I have a man who loves me completely, who sees every part of me, the curator and the strategist, the woman who can authenticate paintings and suggest how to eliminate threats, and values all of it. You're not offering salvation, Robert. You're offering erasure. Again." The sound of approaching vehicles pulled her attention. Randall's convoy moving with controlled urgency into the parking garage, having been alerted the instant her security detail had flagged an anomaly. 3 black SUVs positioned themselves with tactical precision, disgorging men who moved with the efficiency of people who'd trained for exactly this scenario. Randall emerged from the center vehicle, his expression transitioning through recognition, rage, and barely restrained violence in the space between car door and where Robert stood. He crossed the distance with predatory purpose, his men forming a perimeter that transformed the parking garage into something that looked civilized, but felt lethal. "Step away from my wife," Randall said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that preceded murder. Robert raised his hands again, but his expression had shifted to something between fear and defiance. "I'm trying to help her. To give her a way out before you—" "Before I what?" Randall interrupted, his hand moving toward where Kathleen knew he kept a weapon. "Before I love her? Protect her? Give her everything she deserves? You're a criminal. You've made her complicit in—" Randall's laugh was sharp, humorless. "She chose this. Chose me. With full knowledge of what it meant. You're the one who broke her, dismissed her, blamed her for your own weakness. Don't pretend this is about her welfare when it's really about your ego." The tension stretched taut enough to snap, violence hovering in the air like pressure before a storm. Kathleen watched Randall's expression harden into something she recognized, the decision point where he transitioned from man to weapon, where love became protective violence. He turned slightly toward her, his eyes asking permission she understood without words. "He's tried to destroy you twice. With betrayal, then with false salvation. Do I end him? Or do you want him to live knowing he failed at both?" Kathleen stepped between them, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward, but her intention clear. She placed her scarred hand on Randall's chest, feeling his heart race beneath her palm, and felt him still immediately. Then she turned to face Robert with the full authority of who she'd become. "You want to save me? You destroyed me 4 years ago, blamed me for your weakness, made me feel small and insufficient and not enough, and you never looked back until you saw someone else value what you'd discarded." Her voice carried across the parking garage, witnesses to this final dismissal. "This isn't salvation, Robert. This is ego. You can't stand that I found something real after you proved yourself worthless." "I'm not trapped in Randall's world. I'm home in it. Because he sees me completely and loves me anyway. Because he'd burn this city before he'd let anyone hurt me. Because he's given me the one thing you never could. Absolute certainty that I matter." She shifted, her hand moving to rest on her pregnant belly. "I'm carrying the child of a man who knows how to love me, who chose me not despite my complications but because of them, who makes me stronger rather than demanding I be smaller." She let silence hang for 3 heartbeats before delivering the final blow. "You're not worth his hands getting bloody again. Leave New York, forget I exist, and spend your life knowing your betrayal gave me everything I actually needed. It cleared the path to finding someone worthy of what I had to offer." Robert's face cycled through emotions too quickly to catalog. Shock, rage, humiliation, and finally something that might have been understanding, or might have been defeat. He looked at Randall, whose expression remained murderous but controlled, waiting for Kathleen's choice to be honored. "You heard my wife," Randall said quietly. "Leave. And if you ever approach her again, mercy won't be an option I'm offering." Robert fled, stumbling slightly in his haste, his departure witnessed by armed men and security cameras that would ensure he understood exactly how generous Kathleen's dismissal had been. The SUVs didn't pursue, but Kathleen knew they'd track his movements until he left the city, ensure that this threat was neutralized not through violence, but through her absolute indifference to his existence. When the garage had emptied of everyone except Randall and her personal security detail, Randall pulled her against him as carefully as possible given her pregnancy. "You're magnificent," he said against her hair. "Absolutely terrifying and magnificent." "He was never worth your violence," Kathleen replied, letting herself lean into his strength. "He was barely worth my words." That night, as they lay in bed with Randall's hand resting protectively on her belly, Kathleen received a text from an unknown number. "Left for Boston? Won't contact again?" She deleted it without responding, the final communication from Robert Bonnet disappearing like he deserved to, into irrelevance and silence, his last attempt at control dismantled not by violence, but by the simple truth that she'd outgrown him so completely that his salvation had become meaningless noise. Dominic Brett entered the world at 3:47 on a February morning, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn determination, screaming his protest at the indignity of birth, with lungs that suggested he'd inherited the Brett capacity for making himself heard. The private hospital wing had been secured like a military installation, armed men at every access point, medical staff vetted through channels that asked no questions, technology that could detect threats before they materialized. But inside the delivery room, stripped of context and protection, it was just Randall and Kathleen and the overwhelming magnitude of creating life together. Randall cried when the nurse placed their son in his arms for the first time, tears streaming unchecked down his face as he stared at the tiny human who carried their combined bloodlines and all the hope and terror that entailed. His hands, which had killed men, signed orders that ended lives, built an empire on calculated violence, held their son with a gentleness that made Kathleen's throat tight with emotion she couldn't quite name. "He's perfect," Randall whispered, his voice breaking. "He's perfect, and we made him, and I don't know how to protect something this small." "You'll learn," Kathleen had answered, exhausted and elated in equal measure. "We both will." Parenthood transformed them in ways neither had anticipated. Randall became obsessed with legitimacy, not abandoning his empire but building something cleaner alongside it, investments and businesses that would be Dominic's inheritance without the blood. Real estate development, technology ventures, art galleries that actually focused on art rather than laundering money. He worked 18-hour days restructuring operations so their son could choose violence or choose peace without the decision being made for him by legacy alone. Kathleen discovered a protective ferocity that surprised even Randall. When Agent Chen appeared at the gallery 6 weeks after Dominic's birth, her offer of witness protection somehow still on the table despite everything, Kathleen had looked at her with cold clarity and said, "Come near my family again and you'll learn exactly how much of my husband's violence I've absorbed. Leave, now." Chen had left. Her RICO case collapsed 3 months later, when key witnesses mysteriously recanted testimony and evidence chains broke in ways that suggested someone with resources had systematically dismantled her investigation. The FBI reassigned her to cybercrime in Seattle. The Brett family earned a measure of peace that felt precarious, but genuine. Kathleen's parents called after seeing Dominic's birth announcement in the society pages they still read, despite having disowned her. Her mother's voice carried false warmth. "We'd love to meet our grandson. Perhaps we could move past this unpleasantness." "No," Kathleen had interrupted. "You chose Victoria when she slept with my fiancé. You chose Robert when he blamed me for his betrayal. You don't get to choose Dominic now that he's convenient for your social standing." She'd paused, letting silence stretch. "I'll allow supervised visits twice a year. You'll never be alone with him. You'll never contradict how we're raising him. And Victoria is permanently excluded. Those are my terms." Her mother had sputtered protests, but her father, more pragmatic, had accepted. They saw Dominic every Christmas and his birthday. Stiff visits where her parents treated her with careful neutrality, and Dominic with grandparental affection that felt performative but harmless. It wasn't forgiveness. It was boundary setting. Family redefined on her terms rather than theirs. 2 years after the blood oath kiss, Kathleen stood on the penthouse balcony, watching Manhattan's lights compete with emerging stars. Dominic asleep in Randall's arms, after a long day of learning to navigate his world with the determination of someone who'd inherited both his parents' stubbornness. At 2, their son already showed signs of his father's intense focus. The way he studied things before touching them. How he observed people with assessment beyond his years. The careful deliberation in his movements that suggested he was cataloging information even as he played. Kathleen traced the scar on her palm, faded to silver but permanent, a thin line that caught light and reminded her of the night everything changed. She thought about the woman she'd been at that gallery opening, competent but emotionally armored, performing worthiness for people who would never grant it, hiding behind professionalism because vulnerability had proven too costly. That woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger and more complicated. Someone who suggested strategic violence without moral pause, who'd watched her husband kill to protect her and felt gratitude rather than horror. Who'd built a life in shadows and discovered that darkness wasn't absence of light, but a different kind of illumination entirely. "Regrets?" Randall asked, his free hand reaching for hers, the question ritual between them now, something he asked whenever the weight of their choices felt particularly heavy. Kathleen met his eyes, those dark, dangerous eyes that had seen her completely from the first moment and chosen to love all of it. "None. That night, when you cut our hands and kissed me with blood on your lips, you didn't just claim me, you freed me, from shame, from performing worthiness for people who'd never see it, from the small, safe life I'd convinced myself was enough." She stepped closer, her hand covering his where it rested on Dominic's back. "You gave me permission to be fierce, to be complicated, to be more than the diminished version Robert tried to make me." Randall pulled her against his side with his free arm, Dominic secure between them in the careful way he'd perfected over 2 years of learning to be gentle while remaining lethal. "You gave me something more valuable than territory or power," he said quietly. "You gave me purpose beyond survival. Made me want to build instead of just defend, create instead of just protect. You're the reason I'm more than the violence I was raised for." Dominic stirred in his sleep. his small hand fisting in his father's shirt. And Kathleen felt love so profound it approached pain. This was what they'd built. Not just empire or security, but family forged through conscious choice rather than biological obligation. Sustained by the kind of love that deepened precisely because it survived in darkness rather than despite it. Below them, Manhattan glittered with possibility and danger in equal measure. A city that belonged to them and threatened them simultaneously. Somewhere in those streets, Robert lived his diminished life in Boston. Victoria raised her child alone. Agent Chen pursued other criminals with the same dogged determination she'd wasted on them. Her parents maintained their careful distance, trading authenticity for access. The art world that had once defined Kathleen's identity continued without her. Curators and collectors who'd chosen acceptable safety over complicated truth. And none of it mattered. None of their judgment or their distance or their disapproval could touch what she'd built with Randall. This family that existed outside conventional definitions of acceptable. Let them all witness, Kathleen whispered against Randall's shoulder, her words carrying across the balcony into night air that smelled of city and possibility. Robert, Victoria, Agent Chen, everyone who said I was making a mistake. Let them see what betrayal actually gave me. A man who'd burn the world for me. A son who'll know what real strength looks like and a life that's absolutely perfectly mine. Not safe or acceptable or any of the things I was supposed to want. But real. Authentic. Worth every bridge I burned to get here. Randall shifted Dominic slightly, then took Kathleen's scarred hand in his own scarred palm, pressing them together the way he had that night at the gallery when everything changed. Until death and beyond it, he said, the words ritual and promise and truth. That's the blood oath. That's the commitment we made before witnesses. That's forever, Kathleen. You and me and whatever family we build, whatever empire we create, whatever legacy we leave. Forever. She kissed him then, tasting 2 years of marriage and struggle and love that had been tested by everything their world could throw at them, and emerged stronger for the battering. Dominic made a small sound of protest at being squished between them, and they both laughed, the sound carrying across the balcony into Manhattan's endless night. The Brett family, forged in blood, claimed through ancient ritual, sustained by love that only grew in darkness, stood together watching stars emerge above the city's light pollution. A family that shouldn't work by any conventional measure but functioned perfectly by theirs. A marriage built on violence and tenderness in equal proportion. A son who would inherit both legacy and choice, raised by parents who understood that real strength came from facing darkness rather than pretending it didn't exist. Kathleen traced Randall's scarred palm one more time, feeling the raised line that matched her own. Permanent evidence of the night she'd stopped performing and started living. She thought about the gallery, the blood, the kiss that had changed everything, and felt nothing but profound gratitude that betrayal had led her here, to this balcony, this man, this child, this absolutely perfect life she'd built from the ruins of who she'd been expected to be. Robert's betrayal hadn't destroyed her. It had freed her to find someone who actually knew how to love her completely. And that, she thought, watching her husband hold their sleeping son against the backdrop of the city they ruled together, was the only revenge worth having. Not his suffering, but her happiness. Not his regret, but her certainty. Not proving him wrong, but simply not caring enough about his opinion to bother. She'd won by building something beautiful with someone worthy. Everything else was just noise fading into Manhattan's eternal symphony of possibility and danger, love and survival, the kind of life that could only be lived by people brave enough to choose truth over safety. And Kathleen Brett, formerly Gilpin, formerly broken, now whole, had never been more certain that she'd chosen exactly right. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.